The last unit in this module is a unit in which I've brought together, collected 12 tips for teachers, which may help them to increase engagement among students, to foster the motivation of learners. So it's a very personal choice. I hope you will understand a couple of the issues I will raise, and I hope you can relate them to the previous introduction into more basic concepts related to the issue of motivation in education. So I would like to make a few comments on, which are relevant for the content, relevant for the issue of relevance itself, and the structure of what you actually teach. I keep in mind here the teacher who actually gives a course for perhaps a large group of undergraduate students, but also in smaller areas. So that's a bit my point of departure, the academic, the higher education environment in which students are taught. Okay, so first of all, the first tip has to do with providing authentic problems. We have already discussed that authenticity in itself may not be enough, but it is an important issue. Many authors, also authors in the domain of instructional design, like Jeroen van Merijenboer, we have been discussing his work. They do emphasize that authenticity of problems is very relevant. I remember that when I taught psychology, educational psychology at Leiden University, Piet Fraun was still one of the very, very popular teachers there, and he always started his classes with a very actual problem, a political problem, for instance, for which he suggested a very, very unorthodox solution. He was very famous for unorthodox solutions, but that drew the attention of many students. So his classes were always filled to the last seat, and because of this, starting with interesting and thought-provoking problems. I also advise students when they have to write a paper. So also I would advise you as PhD students, when you have to write a paper, to start with a concrete problem, a problem of which you can make clear that the solution is definitely necessary in order to prevent the ending of the world, so to speak. So it's a very serious problem, and the readers who do start to read your paper, they have to be convinced that they have to read until the end of the paper in order to read what the solution is for the problem. So there must be some very clear urgency in your problem statement, which helps the reader to be motivated and engaged to read your paper. So providing such a problem at the very start of your talk or of your paper, being it a research presentation or just a course for students, a class for students, helps to attract the attention. Of course, you have to return to the problem later on, but it's definitely a means to engage students in following your presentation. That's the first tip, authenticity. And then the second one is a very old statement by Kurt Lewin. I've been discussing this statement very often with colleagues who were convinced that it is completely nonsense. So interesting to explore here. There's nothing as so practical as a good theory. What this statement is saying is that students should be convinced that practice and theory go hand in hand, and that we cannot develop our understanding, let alone predict what will happen in the world around us, without being able to relate what we see to what we already know, because by using our knowledge, we are able to see, in fact, to understand what's happening, or at least to distinguish in our environment what does occur over there. So theory is like the glasses you use to see. I already went through the relevance of the behavioral and the cognitive and the constructivist perspective, relevant for distinguishing between what's important and what's not important in a learning situation, for instance. Okay, so the relationship between theory and practice is very relevant. I had the pleasure to supervise the thesis by Janneke van der Pol in Utrecht University at the moment, at least, and so she was able to develop a model for how teachers should scaffold, the work of students working in a group, arriving at a particular product. Well, this scaffolding model, she was able to further elaborate and refine and extend. And that particular model helped her, to understand what was happening. But it was also a very important scaffold for teachers who want to support students in group work. So the theory was really very, very, very relevant to the practical situation in that particular learning environment. So theories are important and do give you a sense of control, do increase your feeling of competence, and that's why people are motivated when they can make use of a theoretical framework in order to understand what is happening. Okay, activating education stimulates induction and deduction. Well, we were talking already about theory and practice, and induction and deduction, are means to reason from the phenomena you observe to the theoretical framework in which they can be placed and in which they receive their meaning, so to speak. But also deduction, you can make predictions based on your theoretical understanding of a situation and try to find evidence which either confirms or disconfirms your hypotheses. So you can help students to arrive at such an active attitude, to be engaged, cognitively engaged and behaviorally engaged, by creating learning environments in which they do have to be active. I once learned from Alan Collins, a very, very old, already very old and famous scholar in the United States, working, for instance, in the domain of cognitive apprenticeships, that it makes sense when you are trying to explain a particular concept or theory to a group of students, that you say, okay, I will take now, let's say, a quarter of an hour to explain this concept, and after that period, I will ask somebody at random to ask a question. When you are listening and taking notes, etc., during my explanation, you might already think of a question you might ask later on when this quarter of an hour has been passed. So be a bit active during my explanation. Now, when you do such a thing, people start to become a bit concerned about, that they might be picked out of the group and have to pose a question. So they are starting to listen more actively, and they are starting to relate what you as a teacher are telling to what they already know, in order to identify, discrepancies or whatever gives rise to a question. So that makes them more active learners and more engaged learners, because they have to relate what they hear to what they already know. So, okay, a very, I think, good advice to raise the level of engagement of students. The fourth one here is also the content advice, a content tip. which I learned from Henry Gleitman, who was a very famous psychologist in the 70s and 80s of the last century. I actually taught an introductory psychology course based on the book of Henry Gleitman for a couple of years at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And I was very much impressed by a paper written, I think it was in The American Psychologist by Henry Gleitman, in which he explained how he actually taught his Psych 1 course, his introductory psychology course. And this was an important statement, I think. So they won't care if they don't feel that I care. So you have to show as a teacher, also as a supervisor, of course, that you really care for the issues, and that you really are emotionally engaged in the topic of a particular subject matter area or study or PhD project or whatever. So if you make visible that you care, then students will also care. And if you do not do so, they won't care either. So that is an important, interaction between the teacher and the student, providing, all kinds of opportunities for students to become engaged. Show your care about the subject matter, and also about the student, of course. So these are our advices which may help, starting from the content of your the domain you are teaching, which may help to raise the level of engagement of students. Then there are a couple of advices having to do with relevance. Clear goals increase expectancy. Perhaps I have already mentioned that, but you as a teacher should not only cater for, intrinsically motivated students, but also for extrinsically motivated students. And these students who may have a focus on performing, so may have a performance goal orientation, they really are in need of clear goals, clarity, when they are preparing for a particular test or other academic, situation where they have to prove themselves. So providing clear goals is indeed very, very important. I think all students have the right, so to speak, to be informed about the goals, the terms they are tested on, for instance, when they are preparing for a test or an exam. And it should not left in confusion about what they have to show. So be clear about your goals. Also be clear about the goals you want to achieve in a particular class or in a particular work group session or whatever. So write things down, perhaps, on the blackboard or on a short list. So make clear what you want to establish. And that helps also to raise not only the interest of the students, but also, and more importantly, perhaps their expectancy level. So when they know what they have to perform, then they feel more secure about their competence to do so, and that definitely increases their motivation. So therefore, clarity of goals is a very important advice, I think. This is the sixth one is a bit related to the fifth one. Good tests do cover course content, so make your tests in fact representative of the content you want to take your exam on, and reflect both theory and practice, as you already indicated. So provide test questions, for instance, in which students have to relate theory to practice, or in which they have to relate, let's say, experimental outcomes to theoretical concepts, which I'm doing most of the time with the assignments in this particular course. I ask you to view a particular or observe a particular video clip and then try to interpret that in terms of a particular theory. Well, that is an example of a test in which theory and practice are related, in which you as a student are asked to relate the two. Extrinsic rewards can elicit intrinsic motivation. Actually, we have been discussing that at some length when studying the self-determination theory. So there you saw how Deci and Ryan hypothesized or theorized that this extrinsic motivation or extrinsic control might gradually become internalized and integrated and become a sort of internal motivation. I remember that I helped my second daughter in secondary school with her math problems at home, and she was concerned about not finding the answers right away. So when we were in the first grade of secondary school, she became very angry when she did not immediately saw the solution of a particular math problem. So she hated mathematics, and I tried to help her, but very often this ended in a row because I was not clever enough, to give the right cues for her to find the answer. Anyway, we continued to collaborate. But when we were in the 6th grade, so the final grade of the secondary school, we again did some math problems, and these problems were already, far too complex for me to understand. So whenever I tried to help her, I suggested a particular, solution or a particular avenue to a solution, and then she immediately said, "No, that's very irrelevant what you were talking about now. But okay, now I see what I have to do." So my mistakes helped her a bit to find the proper way to a solution. But when we did so, I tended to ask her, "Sarah, I think I have the feeling when I see you working on these math problems that you are beginning to like these problems a bit." And of course she threw that away immediately and making the comments that I was a complete fool, by suggesting such a thing. But in fact, I think there was a shift from extrinsic motivation towards more intrinsic motivation. But that was based, in her case, I think also on the fact that she felt more competent, so that her expectancy went up dramatically, and therefore there was room for her to appreciate the content of the problem. She was not anymore to such an extent completely, taken away by the problems which might arise from not finding the answer. So perhaps, in fact, so the development of competence may be a sort of bridge, from extrinsic orientation rewards to intrinsic motivation. And again, that has been, of course, explained by Detchi and Reying in their self-determination theory. Okay, now the last couple of advice have to do with the structure of the learning environment. The first one, remove everything that distracts attention, is in fact, a clear-cut behaviorist advice. As I have been explaining, I think in at various places in the course, removing distracting stimuli is very helpful in creating the conditions for learning. So that's one thing you have to take into account. But perhaps it's a more generic advice is to support students in developing a clear understanding of the conditions for which learning in their own situation is most appropriate. So perhaps some students do like to work at night, and other students do like to work with the daylight, or some want to have some music in the background, and others do not. The important thing is that each and every student discovers what makes her or his learning environment conducive to learning, and that is a thing you might help students to discover. Start with an outline and an agenda. I already mentioned that. So whenever you give a presentation or whatever, make clear beforehand what you are going to do, simply, because then students and your audience in general know when you have accomplished your goal at the end, and they can feel satisfied and said, he was planning or she was planning to do this and that, and actually she accomplished that. Of course, you have a problem when you do not accomplish the goals you have set beforehand. But, well, okay, you have to envisage that particular issue and try to make sure that you arrive at a solution at the end. For me, it was not always easy, I must admit. Well, make failing on a test very unattractive. That is an advice which came from, in fact, from colleagues working at the medical school of Groningen University during the 90s, when there were very, 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 very unfavorable dropout rates there. There the people, Willem Hofstee and Janke Cohen-Schotanus, actually discovered that decreasing, the number of opportunities to do a test for a second or a third or a fourth time, actually decreasing that number increased the success rate. So students discovered that it was very, very risky to fail on an exam because there was only one other opportunity, and then they had to wait for a whole year to do the exam for the second time. So that made them, more engaged, in fact, to properly prepare for the exam. So reducing the number of opportunities to retest made failing on the test very unattractive, and that contributed to the engagement of the students. So in a general sense, you might consider making failing indeed very unattractive by creating all kinds of conditions which make it difficult for students to do the test a second time, or whatever conditions you have to pass after a first failing. Okay. Provide student tailored support. We already discussed that. I think also in the positive behavior support model, we saw that at the third level, students receive a very tailored support addressing the particular needs they have and helping them to overcome these problems. So, in fact, that also contributes to their feeling of, being taken seriously as a student. And then the last one, make students responsible for their own education. This seems a bit paradoxical, because in many situations nowadays, students do ask for very clear objectives and structures, etc. And I already said that these objectives should be clarified beforehand. So there is no reason to return to that statement and that advice, but there may be a detrimental consequence, and that is that students become dependent upon your guidelines. So being clear does not mean making students dependent. So you have to be active in developing and supporting the feeling of autonomy of students, and you may even try to make, you have to make them responsible for their own learning and education, which contributes to their feeling of autonomy. But you have to address that actively, because students may feel in an easy mood just to follow what the teacher says and start to complain whenever the teacher does not specify to the level of detail they expect what they have to do. So this is an issue to further consider, I think, finding the proper balance between freedom and structure, as we have been discussing before. Okay, so now we have finished these 12 tips for teachers, which to a certain extent I think is the reflection of the discussion we had before on the various, theoretical frameworks having to do with motivation in education. And in that sense, we completed this particular module on motivation and engagement in education. I hope you have received some points of departure to further explore this domain, which is very important and inspiring, in fact. But it also needs a lot of work to do before we actually are able to create conditions, also as far as motivation and engagement is concerned, which really help students to arrive at the goals they have set before.